Picture this, a young woman, barely 16, her wrists bound with iron shackles that have rubbed her skin raw. She stands in a crowded marketplace, not as a buyer, but as merchandise. Her eyes, once bright with dreams, now stare vacantly at the ground as potential owners examine her like cattle. This wasn't medieval Europe or colonial America. This was ancient India over 2,000 years ago. We celebrate ancient India for its profound spirituality, its philosophical brilliance, its mathematical innovations. We marvel at the Upanishads, the wisdom of Buddha, the glory of empires like the Mauryas and Guptas. But buried beneath these golden narratives lies a darker truth that history books often skip over entirely. How could a civilization that gave the world concepts of ahimsa, dharma, and moksha simultaneously normalize the most brutal forms of human bondage? How did a society that produced saints and sages also create systematic markets for trading women like commodities? The answer is more disturbing than you might imagine. Female slavery wasn't just tolerated in ancient India. It was institutionalized, legalized, and even sanctified by religious doctrine. From the bustling slave markets of Pataliputra to the hidden chambers of royal palaces, millions of women lived and died in chains, their suffering erased from our collective memory. Tonight, we're going to uncover these buried stories. We'll explore the mechanisms that turned daughters, wives, and mothers into property. We'll walk through the same marketplaces where human beings were bought and sold like grain or livestock. We'll peer behind the ornate walls of palaces where enslaved women served masters who saw them as less than human. This isn't just ancient history. The systems, justifications, and attitudes that enabled this horror have echoes that reach into our modern world. Understanding how an entire civilization convinced itself that enslaving women was not just acceptable, but natural and divinely ordained, reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and social power. But the women who suffered weren't just statistics. They had names, dreams, families. They developed survival strategies, formed secret bonds, and sometimes fought back in ways that would surprise you. Their stories deserve to be told, not to sensationalize their pain, but to honor their humanity and ensure we learn from history's darkest chapters. What we're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient Indian civilization. But this journey into darkness is necessary, because only by confronting these buried truths can we understand how such systems took root and flourished for centuries. The slave markets of ancient Pataliputra operated with the efficiency of any other commercial enterprise. Every morning at dawn, traders would arrive with their human cargo, women and children who had become property through conquest, debt, or birth into the wrong caste. The Arthashastra, Kautilya's ancient manual of statecraft, describes these transactions with chilling bureaucratic precision. Wars provided the largest supply of slaves. When kingdoms clashed, victorious armies didn't just seize gold and territory, they systematically rounded up women from defeated populations. Young mothers were separated from their children, daughters were torn from families. Elderly women deemed unfit for service were often killed on the spot, while younger women faced a different fate entirely. The process of commodification was deliberately dehumanizing. Women were stripped, examined for physical defects, and categorized by age, beauty, and perceived abilities. Merchants developed specialized vocabulary to describe their human merchandise. A trained slave commanded higher prices. These were women who had already been broken by previous masters, taught to serve without question or resistance. Debt slavery created another steady stream of victims. Ancient Indian law permitted creditors to claim not just a debtor's property, but his family members as well. A single failed harvest or business venture could condemn an entire household to bondage. Fathers sold daughters to pay off loans, husbands surrendered wives to creditors. The legal texts describe these transactions matter-of-factly as natural consequences of financial failure. Caste played an equally sinister role. Women born into certain communities were considered naturally suited for slavery. The Dharmashastra texts explicitly state that some castes existed to serve others, making enslavement appear as fulfillment of cosmic duty rather than exploitation. This religious justification made resistance seem not just futile, but spiritually wrong. The actual trading process reveals the systematic nature of this industry. Slave merchants operated established routes between different kingdoms, moving human cargo like any other valuable commodity. They maintained breeding facilities where enslaved women were forced to produce children who automatically became property. The most beautiful women were reserved for wealthy buyers, kings, merchants, and religious institutions that could afford premium prices. Ancient inscriptions and palm leaf manuscripts provide disturbing details about pricing structures. A young, skilled woman might cost the equivalent of several cattle or a small plot of land. Pregnant slaves were sold at reduced rates, their unborn children included as bonus merchandise. Elderly women past their productive years were sometimes sold in bulk lots for manual labor. The buyers weren't just individuals, they were institutions. Temples, monasteries, and royal courts all maintained large populations of enslaved women. Religious orders justified their ownership of human beings as necessary for maintaining spiritual purity, claiming that slaves performed polluting tasks that monks or priests couldn't touch. But perhaps most chilling was how normalized these markets became. Ancient travelers' accounts describe slave auctions as routine parts of urban life, no more remarkable than grain markets or livestock fairs. Children grew up seeing human beings bought and sold, absorbing the message that some people were simply born to be property. These weren't isolated incidents or temporary wartime disruptions. Archaeological evidence suggests organized slave trading operated for over a millennium across the Indian subcontinent. The infrastructure was sophisticated, permanent, and deeply integrated into the economic and social fabric of ancient Indian civilization. Yet somehow this massive system of human trafficking has been largely erased from popular historical narratives, leaving us to wonder what other uncomfortable truths lie buried in the past. Behind the magnificent facades of ancient Indian palaces lay a hidden world of systematic sexual exploitation that would shock even modern sensibilities. Royal harems weren't the romantic fantasies depicted in later literature. They were sophisticated systems of captivity where hundreds of women lived as prisoners, their bodies considered property of the crown. The Mauryan court at Pataliputra employed over 3,000 women in various forms of servitude. Ancient Greek ambassador Megasthenes recorded his horror at discovering that the emperor's personal quarters housed not wives or willing courtesans, but captured women from across the empire. These weren't marriages or consensual relationships. They were institutionalized rape facilitated by state power. The recruitment process reveals the calculated nature of this system. Royal agents scoured conquered territories, specifically hunting for young women to stock palace harems. Beauty wasn't the only criterion. Intelligence was equally valued, as smart women could be trained for more complex forms of service. The most desirable captives were daughters of defeated nobility, whose enslavement sent powerful messages about submission to royal authority. Life within palace walls followed rigid hierarchies that mirrored broader caste structures. At the top were women who had borne male children to rulers. Their elevated status came at the ultimate price of forced motherhood. Below them were entertainers trained from childhood in dance, music, and sexual performance. At the bottom were common domestic slaves who cleaned, cooked, and maintained the elaborate infrastructure that supported this system of captivity. The security measures around these women reveal how thoroughly their masters understood they were holding prisoners, not willing participants. Ancient architectural texts describe harem quarters with walls 20 feet high, guarded entrances, and interior layouts designed to prevent escape. Windows faced inward toward courtyards rather than outward toward freedom. Even female guards were often enslaved women whose families were held hostage to ensure loyalty. Wealthy merchants and noble families copied these royal models on smaller scales. Archaeological excavations of elite residences reveal similar architectural features. Women's quarters separated from main houses, restricted access points, and living spaces that were essentially luxury prisons. Domestic slavery wasn't limited to manual labor. It encompassed complete ownership of women's bodies, minds, and reproductive capacity. The psychological impact of this captivity was deliberately cultivated. New slaves underwent systematic training designed to break their will and reshape their identities. They were given new names, forced to abandon family ties, and taught that their previous lives no longer existed. The most successful adaptation strategy was complete submission. Women who accepted their status as property received better treatment, while resistance brought swift, brutal punishment. Religious justifications made this exploitation appear sacred rather than criminal. Palace priests conducted ceremonies blessing new concubines, transforming rape into religious ritual. Ancient texts describe harems as necessary for maintaining royal purity and cosmic order. Kings claimed divine authority over women's bodies, making resistance not just illegal but spiritually damning. The economic aspect was equally calculated. Enslaved women produced goods for palace use and external sale: textiles, jewelry, perfumes, and other luxury items that generated revenue while keeping their hands busy. Their children automatically became royal property, creating self-sustaining populations of slaves who knew no other life. But perhaps most disturbing was how this system normalized sexual violence throughout society. If kings could own hundreds of women, why couldn't wealthy merchants keep dozens? If religious authorities blessed royal harems, how could anyone question domestic slavery in noble households? The palace system created templates for exploitation that permeated every level of society. Some women found ways to navigate this nightmare with remarkable intelligence. Historical records mention instances of enslaved women who gained influence through wit, political acumen, or strategic alliances. A few even managed to secure freedom for their children, though they themselves remained captive until death. These weren't ancient customs we can dismiss as products of their time. They were systematic crimes against humanity, enabled by sophisticated legal, religious, and social structures that treated women as inherently less human than men. Dawn brought no relief to the enslaved women of ancient India. Their days began before sunrise with back-breaking labor that would continue until collapse. But physical exhaustion was only the beginning of their nightmare. The psychological torment was designed to be even more devastating than the whips and chains. Punishments for perceived disobedience were deliberately public and brutal. Designed not just to discipline individual women, but to terrorize entire populations into submission. Ancient legal texts describe sanctioned punishments that included branding, mutilation, and sexual assault. The Arthashastra coldly outlines penalties for slaves who attempted escape. First offense meant cutting off a toe, second offense cost a foot, third attempt resulted in death. The legal system offered enslaved women absolutely no protection. They couldn't testify in courts, own property, or even claim ownership of their own children. Masters faced no legal consequences for rape, beating, or killing their human property. Ancient law codes explicitly stated that crimes against slaves were considered property damage, not violence against persons. A master who killed someone else's slave only had to pay compensation, the equivalent of replacing broken livestock. Sexual violence was systematic and unavoidable. Enslaved women had no right to refuse their master's demands or those of male guests, relatives, or even other slaves designated as overseers. Pregnancy provided no protection. Ancient medical texts describe techniques for forcing labor and extracting work from pregnant slaves until the moment of birth. Many women died in childbirth without medical care, their deaths recorded as minor financial losses in household ledgers. The psychological warfare was equally calculated. Families were deliberately separated to prevent emotional bonds that might inspire resistance. Mothers were sold away from children, sisters torn apart, friendships forbidden. Masters understood that isolated women were easier to control than those who maintained human connections. Some women were forced into specialized forms of degradation that revealed the sophisticated cruelty of their oppressors. Temple slaves faced particularly horrific fates. Sold to religious institutions as children, they were trained in ritual prostitution while being told their suffering served divine purposes. Ancient inscriptions describe temple marriages, where prepubescent girls were wed to deities, becoming property of priestly classes who used religious authority to justify systematic abuse. Yet within this nightmare, remarkable stories of survival and resistance emerged. Enslaved women developed secret communication networks, passing information about escapes, dangers, and opportunities. They created coded songs that preserved their original languages and cultural memories. Some mastered their captors' languages so completely they could gather intelligence about political changes that might affect their situations. Intelligence became their most powerful weapon. The smartest enslaved women learned to anticipate their masters' needs. positioning themselves as indispensable to gain slightly better treatment. Some became informal advisors, using their intimate access to powerful men to gather information that could be used for subtle forms of resistance or protection of other slaves. Motherhood presented both ultimate vulnerability and occasional opportunity, while pregnancy often meant increased abuse and dangerous working conditions. Some women managed to secure marginally better treatment by convincing masters their unborn children had special value. A few exceptional women even negotiated protection or education for their children, sacrificing their own freedom for their offspring's slightly better prospects. Religious faith became another survival mechanism, though often twisted by their circumstances. Some women found comfort in belief systems that promised justice in afterlife, while others secretly maintained practices from their original cultures. The most psychologically resilient created new forms of spirituality that helped them endure daily horrors while preserving some sense of internal dignity. Physical resistance was rare but not unknown. Historical records mention occasional revolts, usually quickly and brutally suppressed. More common were subtle forms of sabotage, breaking tools, ruining food, or deliberately misunderstanding instructions. These small acts of defiance provided psychological relief even when they brought harsh punishment. The strongest survival strategy was forming covert sisterhood with other enslaved women. Despite rules prohibiting friendship, women found ways to care for each other, sharing food, nursing the sick, protecting the vulnerable. These bonds became lifelines in an ocean of cruelty, proving that even in humanity's darkest corners, compassion could survive. But we must remember that survival came at terrible cost. Even the strongest women were traumatized, physically damaged, and robbed of normal human development. Their resilience in the face of such systematic cruelty reveals not the acceptability of their treatment, but the remarkable power of human dignity to persist even under the most dehumanizing conditions. The daily reality these women endured challenges us to understand how societies can normalize such extreme cruelty. The most chilling aspect of ancient Indian slavery wasn't its brutality. It was how completely religious and philosophical systems justified turning human beings into property. The same civilization that produced concepts of universal consciousness and divine love simultaneously created elaborate theological arguments for why some people were born to serve others as slaves. The Dharmashastra texts, considered sacred law by millions, explicitly divided humanity into categories that predetermined life outcomes from birth. These weren't merely social suggestions, they were presented as cosmic truths, divine commandments that questioning would bring karmic punishment. The Manusmriti coldly states that certain castes exist specifically to serve others, making enslavement appear as spiritual duty rather than exploitation. Karma became the ultimate justification for ignoring suffering. Religious authorities taught that enslaved women were experiencing consequences of past life sins, making their current torment not just inevitable but morally necessary. Helping slaves or questioning their treatment became interference with cosmic justice. This perverted logic transformed compassion into sin and cruelty into righteousness. Temple institutions were among the largest slave owners, creating horrifying contradictions between spiritual ideals and material practices. Monasteries that preached detachment from worldly pleasures simultaneously maintained hundreds of enslaved women for labor and sexual service. Religious leaders who taught ahimsa, nonviolence toward all living beings, personally owned human beings and justified their treatment through scriptural interpretation. The Devadasi system exemplifies how religion enabled systematic abuse. Young girls were married to temple deities in elaborate ceremonies that families considered great honor. But these sacred marriages were actually sophisticated trafficking operations that gave religious authorities lifetime access to children's bodies under divine sanction. Parents genuinely believed they were securing their daughters' spiritual salvation while unknowingly condemning them to ritual prostitution. Ancient law codes reinforced these religious justifications with legal frameworks that made slavery appear natural and inevitable. The Arthashastra treats human bondage as routine administrative matter, providing detailed regulations for slave markets, punishment systems, and breeding programs. These laws weren't temporary wartime measures, they were permanent institutional structures that operated for centuries. Philosophical schools that should have questioned human bondage instead found ways to accommodate it within their systems. Even Buddhist and Jain communities, founded on principles of universal compassion, maintained slavery while arguing their spiritual practices were too pure for direct involvement in violence. They outsourced cruelty while maintaining moral superiority. The caste system provided the underlying framework that made all other justifications possible. By declaring some humans inherently superior to others from birth, it created philosophical foundations for treating entire populations as naturally suited for servitude. Religious texts presented these hierarchies as reflections of cosmic order, making social equality appear as rebellion against divine will. Perhaps most tragically, many enslaved women internalized these justifications, believing their suffering was spiritually necessary or karmically deserved. Stockholm Syndrome operated on civilizational scale, with victims defending systems that destroyed them because religious authorities had convinced them that resistance meant eternal damnation. These weren't primitive superstitions that can be dismissed as products of ignorant times. They were sophisticated theological and philosophical systems developed by some of history's most brilliant thinkers, revealing how intelligence without moral courage can enable humanity's darkest impulses. Understanding how advanced civilizations convinced themselves that slavery was sacred helps us recognize similar patterns of justified cruelty in our modern world. The chains may have disappeared, but their echoes still resonate through modern India in ways that should disturb every thinking person. Today's human trafficking networks follow routes established by ancient slave traders. Contemporary caste violence employs justifications refined over millennia. The sexual exploitation of women continues under new names but with familiar patterns. Walk through red light districts in Mumbai or Delhi, and you'll find systems that mirror ancient temple slavery. Young women trapped by debt, religious manipulation, and social stigma. The Devadasi tradition hasn't vanished. It's evolved, with thousands of girls still dedicated to deities and ceremonies that mask organized trafficking. The same families that once profited from temple prostitution now run modern brothels, passing exploitation through generations like inherited businesses. Domestic worker abuse reflects ancient household slavery patterns. Millions of women labor in homes where they're treated as property, subjected to violence without legal recourse. Their children automatically destined for similar fates. The justifications remain eerily consistent. These women are performing their natural duties, serving their karmic destinies, fulfilling cosmic roles. Perhaps most tragically, historical silence enabled these cycles to continue. By erasing slavery from popular narratives, we've allowed its underlying attitudes to persist unexamined. When textbooks celebrate ancient India's philosophical achievements while ignoring systematic human bondage, they implicitly endorse the hierarchies that enabled such cruelty. But understanding this dark history offers hope for breaking these cycles. Recognizing how sophisticated societies convinced themselves that slavery was natural and necessary helps us identify similar justifications operating today. Every time someone dismisses gender violence as cultural tradition or explains caste discrimination as religious necessity, they're using arguments perfected by ancient slave owners. The women whose stories we've uncovered tonight didn't suffer and die for our entertainment. They died for our education. Their buried voices demand that we confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, social power, and moral responsibility. Only by honestly examining our past can we build futures worthy of their memory.